We're going to dive right into today's scripture. This one just so happens to fit perfectly into the theme of Martin Luther King Day, which is approaching us tomorrow. Now, if you're new here, and I think I saw a couple new faces, or if you're just walking by listening in the bar, if it's your first time, we are walking through the verses that are the closest to what the early church believed to be authentic scripture. As many atheists have rightly observed about Christianity, there are lots of contradictions in the Bible. And also, shocking, right? And there's also later additions in the text. So we're seeking to examine the verses at our disposal that likely exhibit early church world tradition and theology. And we're doing that with a book called The Gospel According to the Jesus Seminar. It's a group of amazing historians and theologians that have specialized in studying the early church. It's a composition of the most accurate text throughout the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Thomas, believed to be upheld by the early church. So with that being said, let's dive in. I'm going to read this, and then you all are going to get to talk about it amongst yourselves and share your observations in just a moment. What do the people of this generation remind me of? What are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to one another. We played the flute for you, but you wouldn't dance. We sang a dirge, but you wouldn't weep. Just remember, John the Baptizer appeared on the scene, eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say he's possessed. But the human one, Jesus, appeared on the scene both eating and drinking, and you say there's a glutton and a drunk, a crony of toll collectors and sinners. Indeed, wisdom is vindicated by all her children. Is there any woman with 10 drachmas, which equates to be about half a penny in today's market, by the way? Is there any woman with 10 drachmas who, if she loses one, wouldn't light a lamp and sweep the house and search high and low until she finds it? When she finds it, she invites her friends and neighbors over and says, "Celebrate with me because I found the drachma. I found the half a penny I lost." Is there any one of you who owns 100 sheep and one of them gets lost? Who wouldn't leave the 99 in the wild and go after the one that got lost until he finds it? And when he finds it, he is so happy and hoists it onto his shoulders. Once he gets home, he invites his friends and his neighbors over and says to them, "Celebrate with me because I found my lost sheep." The empire of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When someone finds it, that person covers it up again. And out of sheer joy goes and sells every last possession and buys that entire field. All right, y'all take a moment, share among yourselves. Like if you need to move a little bit closer to a group, that's fine. Talk to each other, share your thoughts. We'll come back and discuss those in just a moment. I would love to hear your thoughts today. Who wants to share? Yes.
I thought it was interesting having the parallel or the sheep reference because coming from an evangelical background, it was like, oh, it's God. That one person is so important.
Mm-hmm.
God's going to lead all of these people to go like find the one. So like, now it's like, how do you deconstruct that now? Deconstructing faith, is that more like, okay, this is representation, or we should go after that one minority that is on the outside thing. That we should be reaching instead of this one person is so special. Yeah.
I definitely like that interpretation better. And that's the one problem with being raised and growing up, quote unquote, in a evangelical, community, is all of these things have been hammered into us in a completely different way than what theologians and historians would actually present this as. So it's just really weird. It's like there's this theology that never was, that somehow gained traction in the late 1800s, and now we're having to unpack it. And the strangest part for me, and I'm sure this is your frustration too, is when you look at like the original language and the context, who the author was, what was going on at the time, and you start trying to piece together what was actually being said, all of a sudden you're a heretic, according to this group of evangelicals, and it's so frustrating. But yes, that is the question that we should always ask is, at least if you've grown up in the church, yes, we've heard it this way, does it mean what they told us it means? That's something we should always ask. Take a couple more. Yes, Val.
I'm curious from the tie-in from the beginning, which is basically saying, no matter what we say, you're not going to hear us. No matter what we do, you're going to see what you want to see. C.
Mm-hmm.
How that ties into the end, which is defined, it's like the treasure that you hide.
Mm-hmm.
This truth is like the treasure that once found is hidden, which is different, right, from the other things, the material things, the sheep, the drachma, those things you share, but the treasure, the truth, you hide. Buy the land, and that's a whole other question, like what's the relationship of land ownership? Historical, like I don't know anything about that. I have my own modern perspective on like land ownership.
Yeah. And actually, I think you're going to be surprised at how the modern problems of land ownership are actually applicable in this culture too. So we'll get to that. That's actually one of the things that shocked me, because I thought this was like some type of spiritually deep metaphor. But actually, it's pretty subversive what Jesus is doing here. So starting out with the first chunk that speaks of the flute and the dirge, it has a very simple modern comparison that is applicable today, because Jesus is referring to how people often ignore the solutions to injustice because we have a tendency to cling to what's comfortable and familiar over things that are productive and beneficial and things that are innovative, because humanity uses every excuse at our disposal to ignore radical change, even if it's to our own benefit, right? Like we see that now. Even, and I'm not saying like he's my favorite candidate or not, but I did appreciate when Pete Buttigieg made the brilliant point that folks on the left need to stop worrying about trying to appeal to folks on the right, because we will never convince them that we are not evil. Because no matter what positive steps we take in policy towards progress, there's always going to be dissent at first. He said if we radically reform our healthcare systems, that they will call us socialists. If we don't reform our healthcare systems, they're going to call us socialists. And it's just like they called John crazy, even though he followed this strict religious diet and didn't consume wine and all of these things. And then Jesus, they called him a demon because he drank and hung out with folks that were drinking as well. Their diets and what they consumed had nothing to do with their criticism. People were scared of their radical mission and what that would mean for that culture. And what it would mean is change. You see, today we can apply that because there are solutions to homelessness, right? There are solutions to fixing our infrastructure. We know what to do. There are solutions to eliminating poverty and combating the climate crisis, ending endless warfare, but people of faith in particular demonize the solutions and they keep praying for answers. It makes no sense. It's like that old joke about the guy that's drowning and a sailboat comes by, and then a cruise ship, and then a helicopter. They all come to save him, and he turns each one of them down in order because he believes that God, not them, will answer his prayers. Well, maybe God sent the sailboat and the cruise ship and the helicopter. So Christians, please hear this. We sound just as silly because I think God gave us socialism to answer our prayers, and we keep calling it the devil. And what is even more wild is that if we examine the themes of Scripture, it is indisputable that if God were a politician in America today, they would more closely align with socialism, and they would probably run as a democratic socialist. In fact, these following verses in today's text are diametrically opposed to the pillars of capitalism that evangelicals so desperately cling to. The stories of the coin and the sheep are interesting because they give enormous value to things that didn't possess much culturally assigned value in themselves. The coin in this verse does not amount to much. Again, half a penny. Half a penny. And neither does the one sheep. This, because if you look at the value of one sheep versus 99, this obviously costs less than the 99. And this is likely because these parables insinuate that the woman and the shepherd in question are in poverty. And this story is challenging unfair economic systems that are just ridiculous. Now, there's two possible interpretations of each story. Let's start with the first one. All right, think about this. No one in their right mind would throw a party if you found a penny in a jacket pocket. All right, you're not going to spend $30 on the party or $100 on the party because you found half a penny. That makes no sense. And you would not risk losing 99 sheep to predators and possibly thieves to leave them alone and go find the one that had been lost, right? Because if money is your motivator, you're going to protect your investment. In this way, these verses, according to the Jesus Seminar, seem to be challenging the things that humanity values. And it seems to be calling them ridiculous. Because money on its own is intrinsically worthless. And the only reason money has value, and the only reason that money had value in the day of Jesus and in our own markets today, is because humanity believed that money has value. It's right up there with the boogeyman, all right? Neither one of them are valuable, neither one of them are real, but somehow both are evil in our minds. Now, in other interpretations, it's possible that this woman in question is so poor that she desperately needs this seemingly insignificant amount of wealth. And what does that say about the economic system of this time? That if she desperately needs what would equate to half a penny in our modern markets. Now, either way, this story seems ridiculous, and that's because it's meant to be read that way. No matter how you spin it, it's a parody on the silliness of unjust markets. And so is the next story. From a financial standpoint, a shepherd leaving their flock unattended is poor stewardship, because it is, right? No one would leave 99 sheep at risk to wolves, at risk to thieves, at risk of getting lost too, because I don't know if you've ever been around sheep, they just kind of do their own thing, right? You're going to go get that one, you're going to come back and the 99 are going to be gone, right? That's just silly. And also, the story could be implicating that because the shepherd is poor, he must leave his other sheep unattended to retrieve his investment and therefore expose the entirety of all of his investments to risk. And how silly is this economic system that others must risk what little investment they have to remain in poverty? And we know what that's like today, don't we? But think about it this way. How often do couples have a child, right? And they find out it's cheaper for most families to have one parent stay at home than it is to pay for childcare, because so many couples are literally paying to go to work because childcare is so expensive, right? I did that when my kids were little. We had one stay home. Like, we would have paid $200 more a week in childcare than it would have cost us to have one of us stay home. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Christopher, this seems like a stretch to draw these comparisons here. How do we know that Jesus in the early church was being subversive here in these texts? And there are two reasons for that. One, much smarter and more credentialed doctors than myself told me that's what it means. So does that. And also because of the following story, and Val pointed this out. A random person in the next story happens to find treasure on land that's for sale. Now, think about this in a modern context. Who owns land in most societies? Wealthy people, rich people, right? Who profits from the sale and rents of land at the expense of the poor? Rich people. So then, this person happens to be on land that's for sale, and they find treasure. Now, it's implied that this treasure is worth much, much more than the land is worth. So that person sells all of their possessions to be able to afford this land, buys the land, and is richer than he was before he bought the land because he deceived the rich person. In this story, the one in poverty takes advantage of the rich. It flips the system upside down as a parody. So therefore, in this knowledge, we must conclude that these verses, whether we like it or not, are political commentary about economic injustice. However, due to the nature of history and canons being compiled by the powerful, the original subversive message of Jesus has been buried in pacification and obscurity. That's what Andy and I were talking about. Before we thought this was a message of salvation. Jesus cares about the individual so much, he'll just leave all the other ones to go get that. Couldn't be further from the original intent of this passage. And as we have seen over the course of a 3-year deep dive into the 5 Gospels, it's clear that Jesus was the leader of a revolution before he was ever the Prince of Peace. Is that really so hard to believe? I mean, it shouldn't be. Not when we as a nation have done the same thing to one of the greatest voices for civil rights in the existence of this nation. Dr. Martin Luther King has also suffered from a bad case of false advertisement and augmentation in our history books by the scripting of those in seats of power. Don't believe me? Let me share some of the radical, lesser-known quotes from Dr. King that history books don't print. Dr. King said this: The problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of financial, political, and racial power. Again, we have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, both here, now, and abroad. There's more. Dr. King said this. I never heard this in school. The evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and evils of racism. But it is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without, at the same time, condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention. And I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. He goes on to say, and what is it that America has failed to hear? America has failed to hear that the promise of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. How true is that? But why is there such a different value system in our history books? Because if you cut these words out of Dr. King and you start compiling them differently and just leave the inspirational, peacekeeping, all-loving aspects of the words of Dr. King, you can fool the populace into believing that we can simply manifest a new and just society into existence with love and tolerance. And though that is a wonderful thought, and how I wish it were true, the truth is thoughts and prayers don't work. The truth is we have to shake things up in society, and Dr. King was not a spiritual pacifist. He was a non-violent, radical, subversive revolutionary like Jesus. Yet I Have a Dream remains one of the most inspirational speeches of all time. But those words, as moving as they are, as beautiful as they roll over our ears, they do not contain the entire ethos of Dr. King. And by subtracting the radical messages of Dr. King, we have done his legacy a great disservice, as we have done the legacy of Jesus in the church. Dr. King in the 60s, whether you know this or not, I didn't know this until a couple years ago. Dr. King in the 60s was painted as an evil communist by the media and maintained only 22% approval from white voters in America. He was classified in newspapers as militant and was even seen as an enemy of the American dream because he dared to expose the nightmares of America's dark history and present. But through constant work and with his amazing voice, his inspiring words, Dr. King continued to gain traction in the civil rights movement. That is, until, like most radicals for justice throughout history, the government assassinated him, just like they did to Jesus. Then his movement was co-opted and his speeches were dissected and shared in sections so that the vision of Dr. King had been twisted and manipulated to nurture injustice and systemic racism by presenting a message not of disruption and redistribution, but rather words of tranquility and words of comfort. So I ask you, church, seeing what happened to the legacy of Dr. King, is it really so difficult to believe that the same thing happened with Jesus? It's not. So in that knowledge, take a few moments, talk about how we can apply this today, and we'll come back and share those thoughts in just a moment. So let's take a couple minutes and share what y'all talked about. Who wants to share? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Yep.
Sharing that I volunteered in elementary school. Of course, Thursday they were reading books about Martin Luther King too. And yeah, it's all the, I have a dream and be kind to each other and there was nothing radical mentioned at all.
Nope, not at all. And how often do you hear that in church?
Except one of the kids did know
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
I know.
That kid is woke. That's awesome.
Yeah.
No, I think that's awesome. I ask myself the same thing when I go into churches, and they seem to hit the same like 12 verses over and over again, and they talk about like salvation and the next life, and they leave out volumes of verses that talk about saving people in this one, and it drives me nuts. Val, you had your hand up, bud.
So one thing we were talking about is the Cass brought up was the difference between civility and civil disobedience.
Oh yeah.
Like we're constantly being told to just get along with each other and
Mm-hmm.
to be nice to each other.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't advance the cause of justice that way
No.
necessarily. And you don't have to be mean,
Mm-mm.
but you have to be disobedient.
Yeah.
And there's this confusion between civility and obedience.
Yep. That is a very good point. And I think the church needs to learn that, because they always quote this one verse in Romans that talks about obeying the laws of the land. And then they ignore the entire section in the Gospels where Jesus disrupted things publicly, where Jesus did things that were against the law. Heck, Jesus was crucified for breaking the law. He was a revolutionary. So this heritage of being holy troublemakers has been lost, and it's been repackaged as politeness. Like, we're taught to be polite to people that are racist, polite to people that are bigoted, polite to people that are tyrannical. I mean, how often do you hear Christians telling each other, or telling each other and their families and us, that we should just respect the president? We should just respect him, and we should just trust that God knows what God's doing. Like, I don't know if God was taking a nap or whatever, but like, this is not a godly administration at all. And the greatest failure of the church, if history reflects it accurately, is going to be our silence in the midst of such evils being done in the name of Jesus, who would have been on the front line on the right side of history. There's another quote of Dr. King's that emerged in my research this week, and I'd like to share it with you all, because I feel that the longer I live here, this message in particular that you never hear in history books desperately needs to be spoken in communities like Santa Cruz. Dr. King said this: "First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the black community's greatest stumbling block in our stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the black citizen to wait for a more convenient season." This was the verse that really stuck out to me, or the passage that really stuck out to me. "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more infuriating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection." Now, people of privilege, this is for us, right? We need to hear this. Whites, it must frankly be said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe subconsciously that they have so little to learn. The reality of substantial investment to assist black peoples into the 20th century, adjusting to black neighbors, and genuine school integration is unfortunately still a nightmare for all too many white Americans. These are the deepest cause for contemporary abrasions between races. Loose and easy language about equality, resonant resolutions about brotherhood fall pleasantly on our ears, but for black people, there is a credibility gap we cannot overlook. We remember that with each modest advance, the white population promptly raises the argument that the black community has come far enough. Each step forward accents an ever-present tendency to step backward. Now that passage stood out to me because far too many, and when I say far too many, I'm talking dozens, far too many people of color that I love, that I respect, that I adore, are abandoning Santa Cruz because of its well-intentioned racism that is often oblivious to locals. And I think it's often denied because we're in Santa Cruz and we like to think of ourselves as a woke community, but we're far from awake. The treatment of City Council person Drew Glover is a perfect example of how our advances in feminism only really apply to white women. And that situation is a beacon for our need to acknowledge intersectionality within our woke politics. But to do so means that white people, people of privilege, we must acknowledge that we still have lots of work to do, and we still have lots of damage that our ancestors did, that people of privilege did throughout the years. We still have lots of damage to undo. Drew is the perfect example of just how racist and toxic people that claim to be woke can be. And to the privileged people of Santa Cruz, I say this: it's not enough that the majority of Santa Cruz supports Colin Kaepernick enthusiastically when he takes a knee. It's not enough when we celebrate the amazing leadership of Justin Cummings taking a seat as our mayor. Fellow people of privilege, we must also celebrate people of color when they take a stand for justice with their words and with their actions. And that is where we have some serious recalibrating to do in this community. Because on the far left, I see two things. I see people of privilege bashing the amazing leaders in the NAACP for asking the community to support their efforts in working with local law enforcement in reforming the system so we can be a just example, unlike our history, to the rest of America. And on the far right, I see people bashing Drew Glover as a sexist because he spoke up to grossly unfair treatment to a woman of privilege, only to be labeled a misogynist by white women in this community. And no matter where you fall in either camp, what I really see is white folks disrespecting black leadership. And if we truly honor the teachings of Jesus and Dr. King, then we must augment our trajectory immediately, for we are hypocrites if we do not. But here's the good news, Santa Cruz. Just because we are far from perfect does not mean that we cannot seek to do better. Justice is not a destination in which we can arrive in this lifetime. It is a journey we must ever commit to walking with each passing of the torch. And in so doing, the terrain for the next generation becomes more level for all that follow suit. So let's listen to, stand behind, and fight with our leaders of color that are fighting for justice and that ask us to be present and be the kind of community that Dr. King had a dream about. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wasteland and protect you through the storms. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to you.